Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm very excited to show you all the process of this character portrait illustration. I'm also very happy to announce that this video was sponsored by Clip Studio Paint, which is the program that I used to make this artwork with. It's actually my first time using this program to make a finished and polished illustration. The only other experience I've had with it before was on the iPad very briefly. I just made a couple of sketches and basically haven't touched it for like a couple of years, so this is more or less my first time using it. And I recorded the process from the very first time I opened the program, so I didn't have any prior experience with it, and I wanted to go into it using just the default brushes, so I did not import any as well. And I'm going to tell you guys about my experience using this program, and I will take you through the entire process of how I created this portrait illustration. So as you can see, the first thing that I'm doing here is testing out all the brushes just to see which one would be best for sketching. I'm gonna do this a couple more times in the video for the next steps following the sketch, but for the sketch step I landed on a brush called Design Pencil, which obviously can be found under the pencil category, and I'm also using the mirror or what's the word for it? Symmetry tool? I guess it's called the symmetry ruler or something like that, but yeah, I had to Google it real quick because I wasn't sure what it was called in this program, but it's an extremely useful tool, and I was super impressed by how useful it is in this program specifically, because you can actually kind of clip the ruler to a layer and then you can move it to other layers, which is something I haven't seen in other programs before, and it's amazing. Actually made the whole process so much easier for me. So yeah, as you can see here, I'm just free-handing the design of the ornate Victorian frame. I obviously looked up a couple of Google image references just to get some ideas for the design. So the reason why I started with the frame is because I had a pretty clear idea of what I wanted the frame to look like, but I wasn't sure what to do with the character or who I was even going to draw at this point, which is why I wanted to just clean up the frame first and deal with it to completion, and then have that done and then move on to the character sketch afterwards. So I'm jumping straight into inking the frame, as you can see here, and I also experimented with some available brushes for inking and actually ended up choosing another pencil brush called a darker pencil, which worked super well, and I liked how it looked. It's not too sharp and it's smooth, and so I just went with it. I usually like a little bit of texture to line work as well, but in this case I didn't really want to get too specific about the brushes that I was picking. I just wanted to go with something that seems to work and make this illustration as quickly as possible, just to see what I can do. I think in the future I definitely want to try importing some of my own brushes, but for the time being I'm extremely happy with how this illustration ended up turning out, in spite of only making use of the default brushes. So yeah, as you can see, the inking process is pretty quick for something like this because it's ornate and mostly decorative, so I don't have to think too hard when I make designs like this usually. And the symmetry ruler tool is so helpful and it makes it so fun. So yeah, it's a pretty quick process over here, and as soon as I was done with inking the frame, I pretty much just went straight into sketching the character. I could have probably found some sort of oval tool to use in order to make the frame more, what's the word? I don't know, polished or something, but I don't know. I figured it was fine to just freehand the lines because it was partially covered anyways. But yeah, as you can see now, the frame is complete, and I was pretty amazed at how quickly I was able to draw the super detailed looking frame just using the mirror tool, so I highly recommend trying to play with that because it's so fun. So yes, as you can see now, I am moving on to the character portrait that is going to be inside the frame, and I'm not too worried about placement at this point because I know that once I get the sketch to completion more or less, I can just move it around. So my primary goal here is to get the sketch looking as close as possible to what I imagine my character's facial features to be, or the mood. The reason why I'm specifically talking about this is because it can actually be quite hard for me to capture the essence of one of my characters when I draw their faces. So this one took a while, and the reason why I keep erasing and fixing certain features is because I just constantly felt like it didn't really look like the character. So I'm slowly trying to fix every single little line just to get the face looking closer to what I imagine her to look like. And this character's name is Noelle, and she's one of the main characters in the comic that I'm currently writing. So I have a ton of background information about her, so I feel like I'm super familiar with what type of vibe she has, which is why I was so adamant on getting it right before moving on. And once I got it more or less to what I was kind of happy with, I moved on to the hair. And I kind of want to mention that the point at which I decided to move on from the face wasn't really the 100% happy point, and I just wanted to elaborate on why. This is because when I ink, so first of all, I have this issue where sometimes when the sketch is too perfect, I have so much trouble replicating it in the ink that something inevitably gets lost, which is why I've noticed over the years that it's sometimes easier for me to just leave the sketch at like a 85% perfection in terms of satisfaction with what it looks like, and then bring it up to 100 during the inking process. That way I feel like I'm perfecting the sketch instead of trying to replicate it exactly with the ink, which can be pretty much impossible for me. I can never get it to look the same. So that's kind of the quick explanation for that. So yeah, I was pretty happy with this sketch relatively quickly, and as you can see, I flipped the canvas and started inking the face. So for the inking here, I'm also using the same brush as I did before, which is the darker pencil brush. When I ink an illustration, which is usually of a character, I usually spend the most amount of time on the face for the same reason that I mentioned before, just to try my best to get the character to look like what I imagined them to. And I actually remembered to save this image right around here, which would have been a disaster if some sort of crash happened, but thank God I remembered it eventually. Anyways, yeah, so I usually ink the face first because it is the most kind of like energy consuming part of the drawing, and then hair is the easier part of it. So sometimes I try to save the best for last, but obviously I always start with the face because it's the most important thing and it kind of dictates the mood of how everything else is gonna go. I don't know if this is like super redundant to mention these micro decisions, but I do sometimes take stuff like that into consideration just to keep the process fun for me. So I kind of dart back and forth between the different parts, and the reason why I decided to ink the jacket, the uniform, or the clothing first is because I know that the hair is going to be draped over it in some parts, but I'm not 100% sure where exactly I'm going to put the hair yet, so I decided to just ink the clothing first and then erase whatever parts of it are going to be covered by the hair, instead of doing the hair first and then like figuring out where the clothes go underneath. I do this quite a bit, and I think it might seem like it's extra work. It actually ends up being faster to do things this way for me. So yeah, as you can see, this is pretty much the end of the inking process, and I'm just defining some lines a little bit to help me see the silhouette with more clarity. And usually what I aim for with the shapes when it comes to drawing like this is to have certain areas that are busier than others and have some areas that are kind of like a rest for the eyes, so it's a rhythm type of situation. Since I'm not actually showing, like, I don't have my hands to point to certain areas here, but I'm sure you can see what I mean. There's like small clusters of detail, so that's usually where I try to put a little bit more detail in the hair, like with the spaces between hair where you can see the background. That's to attract attention to those small areas and kind of take the viewer's eye around the entirety of the illustration. And of course the focal point is the face. So anyway, at this point I am moving on to the really boring stage of every illustration that I make, which is the flat colors. I was pretty shocked to find some comments in my previous videos that some of you guys actually love the flatting stage. It's so boring, oh my god, but which is why I actually ended up skipping it in this video, because I mean, it's just coloring within the lines. But yes, so the important part here, which you are watching right now, is coloring the lines and picking the colors for the lines. So yeah, this can be kind of tricky, and sometimes I will go back and tweak the colors depending on what the rest of the image ends up looking like. But this part is one of the more fun ones for me because it really instantly makes the illustration very pleasant to look at. I wasn't making any radical color choices here also because I already knew that, like, I already know who I'm drawing here, which is my character Noelle, and I know her hair color and her eye color and the general color scheme of the uniform, so I wasn't really like thinking about what colors to pick, kind of went with a super simple color scheme. And I do this a lot. I think it's easy and it makes for a very pleasing result. So keeping it simple is usually a good rule to go by. And as you can see here, I picked a black and red gradient, which I later changed to black to like a dark teal type of aqua green color, which created much nicer contrast in my opinion. But for now on, this is what it's gonna look like. And yeah, so after I finished the flats and coloring in the lines, I decided to give the frame some more volume. And I know that I could have spent a lot more time polishing it, but honestly, I didn't want to spend most of the time of this illustration on the frame because obviously the focal point is still the character portrait that's inside. So I kind of went sort of generic on the shading, and I didn't do a secondary pass with highlights at this stage, and I pretty much ignored it going forward. I'm still kind of debating whether I want to go back and polish it up a little more, but because I'm thinking of using the same frame to do some more character illustrations, character portraits of the rest of my protagonists. But for now, I decided to just leave it as is, and you know, maybe in the future I'll go back and polish it up a little more. But yeah, so what you can see now is I finished a flat dark shading pass, shadow pass, and then I went in to soften some of the edges with a water blending brush, also one of the default brushes that can be found in Clip Studio. And so I softened some of the edges and added a little bit more detail and decided that it was probably enough to move on to the portrait. So I'm going to quickly walk you through my steps when it comes to adding shadows and lighting to a character. So as you can see, I put down very crude shapes, or I don't even know if you can call that shapes. It just kind of looks like jagged lines with a brush, usually a solid brush for this step, and I do that on a separate layer which is set to multiply and about 60% opacity. And I always use a dark burgundy color, like a dark red, to do the shadows with. So after I do the super abstract type of shadow shapes that I imagine, I usually just work from imagination. Actually, 100% of the time I work from imagination on this step. I like to just kind of get a good vibe of what I'm going for, and I just pick like it's easy lighting technically. There's really nothing complicated here. I'm just imagining that the light here is coming from somewhere above in front of the character, maybe a little bit to the left or something like that, but yeah, definitely nothing complicated. And I usually spend quite a while on this. Okay, so this step doesn't actually take very long, but I take my time with, so how do I put this concisely? I like to keep the layer count very low, which is why most of the time I actually use just one shadow layer, but in this particular illustration, as you will see, I actually used two, but I'm still on the first layer of the shadows. And as you can see, I make slow and careful multiple passes of all the areas. So I'll do one kind of like a soft shadow pass, and then I'll go over it again. And since I use the blending tool quite often, it will blend out the color and make it less saturated. So if I go over the same area one more time, not changing any of the brush settings, just using the same brush, same color, it'll appear darker. So that's how I make multiple passes of shadows on the same layer, and eventually the areas that I need to be the darkest will become the darkest areas. So I usually make like maybe 2 or 3 passes, just going around the canvas, frequently zooming out just to see which parts I want to concentrate on, and slowly make my way towards like polishing the result. So usually the lazy route here is to take all the layers and merge them after this step for me, and to use the burn tool to make the areas darker. So that's usually super fast and it only takes like a minute or something. But since I was really liking the result of this illustration so far, I wanted to be more meticulous about it, and so I made another shadow pass layer on top of the one that I already have for the darker areas. So I essentially did the exact same thing. I just made a new layer on top. I set it to multiply and to about 55 or so transparency or opacity this time, and using the same color, same brush, just went over certain areas. This time obviously it's a lot more detail work, and I don't think I've actually done this before, and I don't really lament that because most of the work that I do is client work, and this is one of the first, one of the rare polished pieces that are just of my own character for my own personal use, which is why I was not stingy with the amount of time that I choose to spend on it. And I'm super happy that I decided to take this step because I think it actually makes a really big difference, and it makes the final result so much more delicate and polished than just using the simple burn tool that I usually do to save time. So that's pretty cool. And what was I gonna say? Oh yeah, so one of the coolest things about this particular process that I loved was, so Clip Studio has this this blending mode brush or blender, I don't know, called gouache blender, and it's absolutely amazing. Like, it gives, like, first of all, it's a really nice smooth blender, but it also adds these tiny little pixels to create like the subtle texture. I don't know if you can really see it in the video because the video is quite small, but maybe if you full screen it you'd be able to see the effect. But so I really love this blender. I think it's my favorite blender I've ever used so far. Like the one that I made in the Procreate recently, if you've seen one of my previous videos on the using Procreate, I made a blending brush in that program, and it was pretty decent, and I really liked the effect. It was kind of textured, but it doesn't look anything like this particular blender, and I really love how smooth this one is. So I'm thinking I'm definitely gonna use this program again because it's not that different from the other ones that I use in terms of like, it doesn't have any limitations as far as I can tell. And if I can actually bring in my Photoshop brush presets, it would be perfect. I would be perfectly happy going forward just using Clip Studio Paint from now on. So yeah, I just really love this blending tool. I think it looks so good. And so I was super involved with it, and I spent a long time polishing on the step, like the extra shadow layer, which was a little bit out of the ordinary, like I mentioned, and I was immensely enjoying it. And as soon as I decided to finish up the second shadow pass, I moved on to the next standard part of my process, which is just doing small paint overs on a layer above everything else. And this is one of the best steps because it really adds so much to cover up some of the line work with a paint over. So usually the main points that I cover, or like the main areas that I focus on in the step, are the hair strands, just to make the hair look more alive, and as you can see, to give it more contrast with the hair, like to give some of the hair strands contrast from the strands that are behind it, and to add tiny highlights on various small parts of the illustration, like the eyes, the nose, and whatever else has small details in it. And after I was finished putting in the highlights, I decided to give the paint over, like just give the illustration some extra polish with the paint over. So I wanted to soften some of the line work and add a little bit more depth in certain parts of the hair. And actually, I don't think I've ever gotten such a nice and smooth hair rendering result in an illustration before, which is why I am so pleased with how this turned out, and it was so fun to work on. And yeah, essentially this last part here is where I'm just adding some tiny little highlights on the frame, because I figured the frame now looks kind of unfinished compared to the illustration, and so I wanted to give it just a little more work. And like I mentioned, I'm still debating on whether I should go back and maybe render it a little more, but whatever, we'll see. And the last thing that I did here was just change the background color, because I thought it was kind of blending into the hair at this point, and I really loved the contrast of this teal color, and I think it added like the sort of moodiness that was missing before. And sometimes it can be like an endless process if I keep wanting to go back and add some more polish there and more polish here. So at some point it's good to just, you know, call it quits, because I do see how this process can get out of control and become infinite, because I could technically go back and keep polishing the hair into infinity, but at this point I thought it looked decent enough to call it done. So yeah, and that is the entirety of the process of this portrait illustration. I absolutely love this program. I would totally recommend it to anybody. I think it's a lot more affordable than Photoshop and a lot of the other apps that are out there, and pretty much performs all the same functions. And some of the tools, like I mentioned, the mirror one is especially great, and I am super happy with the results that I got. And yeah, so thank you so much to Clip Studio Paint for sponsoring this video, and I totally recommend that you guys check out this program and see what you can do with this process. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any questions about my process, please don't hesitate to leave a comment down below, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!